Good day. Today is Sunday, 31st August 2025, and probably the big news today is the start of the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the Chinese port city of Tianjin. And many world leaders are gathering there. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, arrived yesterday, I believe, and there's photos of his arrival, and Prime Minister Modi of India is there too. And Modi, at least, has already had a bilateral meeting with the host, who is President Xi Jinping of China, and the two have agreed that their countries are no longer adversaries, but are instead partners, and it looks as if the meeting went well, and that there is a friendly mood between the Indian and Chinese leaders. I understand that other leaders have been traveling to Tianjin too. President Erdogan of Turkey is there. President Pezeshkian of Iran is at least going there. All of the various Central Asian leaders are on their way. The Prime Minister of Vietnam is there too. Interestingly, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, is also going to Tianjin as well. Given his close alignment with the United States and the Europeans, I wonder whether the Russians and the Chinese, and perhaps even the Indians, might wonder about his presence and might be asking themselves whether they have, shall we say, an informer passing on information in their midst, in which case they may handle Pashinyan's presence very carefully. Of course, to say it quickly, that is a guess on my part. But anyway, lots of leaders are turning up in Tianjin, and I understand that yesterday evening, Chinese time, this morning, British time, President Xi Jinping hosted a banquet at which those leaders who have attended, who have already arrived, they were all hosted there. Now, if we're talking about Putin himself, apparently he's brought a massive team of people with him. This is very usual when Putin, the Russian president, goes to China. He doesn't go by himself. The team that he brought with him when he met Trump in Alaska, by comparison, was tiny. It basically consisted of Putin himself, Ushakov, his foreign policy aide, Dmitriev, his investment person, Lavrov, of course, Siluanov, one or two other ministers. In the case of the trip to China, by comparison, I understand at least 10 top ministers of the Russian government are there, including all of the deputy prime ministers. And of course, Lavrov is also there, and military and other people of that kind are there. And importantly, many heads of big Russian companies have come with Putin to China as well. And of course, Putin's visit to China does not end with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. He's going to continue to Beijing. He's going to travel directly to Beijing, presumably with Xi Jinping himself, after the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has ended. He will be staying in Beijing. All of this enormous delegation will be attending with him. There will be all kinds of economic discussions and agreements underway. And I understand that, of course, he will also be meeting not just with Xi Jinping, but also with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, who is also coming. And of course, they will attend the celebrations, and they will watch the parade and all of those things, but there will be massive numbers of economic and business-related contacts. The degree of economic and business interaction between China and Russia is today intense and on an enormous scale, and of course completely dwarfs any interaction between Russia and the United States, certainly current actual economic interaction. But for the record, even planned interaction, even if everything that has been talked about by the Americans and the Russians about joint work in the Arctic, for example, were to happen, Russia's big trading partner, its primary ambitions would be developing its economic relations with China, not with the United States. Now, in the past, in the face of all of the various tariff and economic pressures that have been coming from the United States, I have said that I thought it was likely that before long we would have an emergency meeting of the BRICS states. And sure enough, yesterday, the Brazilian government called for one. Now, I don't know whether this is going to happen in Tianjin. I believe the President Lula of Brazil is coming to Tianjin too, but I haven't seen any record that he is actually there, and maybe he won't be. But anyway, it does look as if an emergency meeting of the BRICS is indeed being convened, and it's already confirmed that Prime Minister Modi of India has asked President Xi Jinping to come to India for the next BRICS, annual BRICS meeting, which is going to take place in India. India now having taken over leadership of the BRICS from Brazil. So anyway, all of this is underway at the present time. I believe that a trilateral meeting of Putin, Modi and Xi is also being planned. So we could see how all of these events are playing out, and Modi and Xi, the Chinese media, full of discussions about the dance of the elephant and the dragon. And of course, if we have a meeting with Putin as well, a trilateral meeting, which is highly likely, by the way, it will be the elephant, the dragon, and the bear. And it will be difficult to avoid the impression that this is happening without some message being sent to the United States as well. Now, in one of my recent programs, I mentioned the very angry and bitter reaction that there has been to some of this from some officials in the United States. Peter Navarro, in particular, Donald Trump's one of Donald Trump's economics people and one of his leaders in conducting tariff policy, and somebody who's taken a lead in negotiations in the past, especially during Donald Trump's first term, in negotiations, trade negotiations with China. Anyway, Peter Navarro has made some furious comments about India financing Russia's war machine, about India supporting Russia. He spoke about his incredulity that India would seriously prefer a relationship with China, which occupies Indian land, as opposed to the relationship with the United States. The trouble is that American officials, in my opinion, have completely misunderstood India and its foreign policy. They have failed to see India for what it is, as a country that has ultimately aspirations to be a great power, that feels that its size, the size of its economy, its rapid economic growth rate, the increasingly large population of highly educated people in India, the size of its armed forces, all of that ultimately point to the day when India will indeed be a great power. And they fail also to understand that India, as a great power or aspiring great power, values its independence, its ability to make its own decisions, has its own foreign policy, its own national interests, and of course, if we're talking about imports of Russian oil, which have been such a vexed topic, and for the record, the Indians are now stepping up their imports of Russian oil. For the Indians, this is a key matter. It's not just that India has an extremely close, long-term relationship with Russia, which it does. It's not just that for both India and Russia, this relationship has now become especially important as balancing out the BRICS, meaning that China is not in a position simply to dominate the BRICS, because there are two other major players, Russia and India, that also have within the BRICS a strategic relationship. It's not just those things. There are also fundamental economic issues as involved as well. So it's now being claimed by various economists in the United States, in the West, that the tariffs that the United States is imposing against India will more than erase whatever earnings, whatever profits India has made from the various discounts, oil discounts that the Russians have been providing. But then this deeply misjudges the nature of the Indian economy, because obviously the countries, the businesses that export to the United States, some of them are important ones, the textile industry, the diamond cutting industry, those sort of industries, and they employ lots of people. But they are not the majority, not remotely the majority of India's enormous population. Many of those people who make up that majority of India's population still live and work on the land. And for them, cheap oil, cheap energy prices is an existential issue. Given that Prime Minister Modi depends politically for these people, given that the Congress, the rival Congress party that might one day seek to replace Prime Minister Modi's party as the ruling party in India again, also needs the support of these people if it is to regain power. Indian governments simply cannot afford to ignore their interests. They cannot simply sacrifice them in the way that the United States appears to assume that they did. And on the bigger geopolitical questions, I am going to say again that it seems to me that the United States, obsessed as it always is, as it continuously is, with its complex games of geopolitical chess, simply does not grasp that these countries, China, India, Russia, not only have their own national interests and, as I said, maintaining stability in the agricultural economy is absolutely one of India's national interests, but they have a history of statecraft that is millennially older than that of the United States itself. They are not obsessed with these intricate games of geopolitical chess that take up and absorb so much of the time and energy in Washington. They don't see the world in that way. Their perspective is longer, it's deeper. China and India have interacted with each other for thousands, literally thousands of years. Russia and China have had diplomatic and trade relations with each other for longer than the United States itself has existed. Sometimes there are periods of tension, sometimes there are deep and profound quarrels, sometimes these countries will seek to hedge with the United States in their various interactions with each other. But long term, they're never going to shape their interactions, these long historic interactions that each of them have, in order to fulfill American geopolitical chess games. It's completely to understand how statecraft works, and it's something that American leaders always seem to struggle to understand, assuming, as they always do, that in their games of geopolitical chess, countries can be expected to act both in an American interest and predictably so. So anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. No doubt there'll be an awful lot more to say about it in future programs. I'm sure we're going to talk about it on the Duran as well. But to be clear, Putin himself is going to be in China for around a week. He's going to have many interactions, and the strategic relationship between China and Russia is going to deepen still further. And the strategic relationship between India and China is, of course, a work in progress, but it will continue to develop as well. And I believe, by the way, I've just seen that there's been a group photograph with all of the leaders who are currently present in Tianjin. But I suspect that before long we're going to have a trilateral meeting of Putin, Modi, and Xi Jinping. Anyway, let's now turn to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to start with the assassination in Lvov, which took place yesterday, just after my video was made, incidentally, of the long-standing political leader, positioned very, very much on the ultra-national right, Andrei Parubiy. Now, in various programs that I have done over the last couple of months, I have discussed the development of a dirty war between Russia, Ukraine, and Russia and Ukraine's Western backers. First and foremost, at least according to the Russian view, Britain, who the Russian intelligence agencies, rightly or wrongly, assume is behind many of the James Bond type activities, the assassinations, the sabotage attempts, the derailing of trains, the planting of bombs on the Kerch Bridge, the attacks on the airfields, the drone attacks on the airfields, all of those things. The Russians believe, probably rightly, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but probably rightly, that the British have played a disproportionate role in all of this, and they are starting. There's been some talk that the Russians are going to start responding, and that to the extent that there is already a dirty war on, the Russians have up to very, very recently held off from an aggressive reaction, but that there have been some telltale signals over the last couple of weeks that in this dirty war, the Russians are starting to take the gloves off. So, for example, some weeks ago in Kiev, a Ukrainian intelligence official, a very senior Ukrainian intelligence official, someone who served in the SBU, the Ukrainian Counterintelligence and Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant Colonel Voronich, who it turned out had been deeply implicated in many of these sabotage and assassination activities in Russia. Anyway, he was assassinated in Kiev, and the Ukrainian authorities claimed that they tracked down his killers, who turns out, by the way, were a couple from Azerbaijan, just to say. But they said that these two people who were killed were Russian agents. Now, to say that quickly, I don't know that these people were Voronich's assassins. There's been no legal finding that I'm aware of that confirms this. And of course, there's been no proof that these people were working for Russia. But as I had already said previously, that I thought that it looked as if the Russians were taking their gloves off in the dirty war. And given Voronich's history and background and the kind of activities he was involved in, it did seem to me likely that the Russians were starting to take reprisals. And then I noticed about a week ago that the FSB, Russia's counterintelligence agency, the agency that is the equivalent, if you will, in Russia of the Ukrainian SBU. By the way, both the SBU and the FSB originated as divisions of another far more famous intelligence and security agency, the Soviet KGB. But I'm going to discuss that some other time. Anyway, the FSB, which, by the way, also has the primary intelligence gathering role in Ukraine. It's the agency in Russia, the intelligence agency and counterintelligence agency in Russia, that is tasked with infiltrating Ukraine, that plants agents there, that collects information there. Anyway, as well as fighting Ukrainian attempts to establish agents and networks in Russia itself. Anyway, the FSB claimed that it had successfully destroyed Ukraine's networks in Russia, that it had infiltrated and penetrated and successfully penetrated them, that the various recent actions that the Ukrainians had taken had exposed their networks, making it possible for the Russians to roll them up. And the FSB, it wasn't directly the FSB, but there were reports in the Russian media which said that by contrast, the Russians, and it presumably is the FSB, have managed to create a wide and a very effective network of agents and cells in Ukraine itself, where the FSB might have been short in this regard at the start of the war. Today, they have established a very large, very effective intelligence gathering apparatus within Ukraine, covering the whole of Ukraine. And, well, you could treat that as another signal that the FSB had now been tasked with taking a forceful action in response to the dirty war that the Russians feel has been imposed upon them. And it is very easy to look at some of the more recent events as consistent with this. In my program yesterday, I mentioned how the missile strikes, the Russian missile strikes in Kiev, close to the British Council building, and close to the representative office of the European Union looked like they were warnings to the Europeans and to the British. Warnings, perhaps, not to even think about deploying British and European troops to Ukraine. Warnings that if they did, Russia had both the means and the resolve to attack those troops. But you could also, equally well, and this is not inconsistent in any way with this point which I've just made and which I made in my video yesterday, you could also see the strikes close to the embassy, the British consulate building and the EU representative office, just as you could see the earlier attack on the British passport office as all parts of the Russian response to the dirty war. The Russians signalling, especially to the British, we know what you're doing, we know what you're up to, we know what facilities you're using, we are going to strike at them, and whether you complain about it, whether you call in our ambassador, whether you take any other action, we simply don't care. You have been doing all sorts of bad and nefarious things to us on our territory. Don't be surprised if we are going to do the same to yours. Now, that leads me up to the assassination of Andrei Parubiy in Lvov. Could it be that he has been assassinated by the Russians as part of this dirty war? Now, there are a lot of claims and allegations that this was the case, and they might be true. I don't know. At the moment, there is very little information about who assassinated Andrei Parubiy, except that the assassination was carried out in broad daylight. It appeared to have been extremely well organized. It was carried out by somebody who appeared to be a courier on a motorcycle. The person was carrying a motorcycle helmet. It is extremely difficult to identify him or perhaps her and work out who this person was and to track this person down. So, a very skillfully organized and carefully prepared assassination. Again, whoever carried it out would also have needed to know where Parubiy was at a particular point in time in order to carry out this attack on him. Now, trying to work this out needs, given the shortage of other clues, perhaps requires understanding a little bit about who Parubiy was. Now, he has been involved in ultra-nationalist politics in Ukraine since he was a teenager, before the Soviet Union itself fell. He has been stridently anti-communist. At various times, he has been consistently hostile to Russia and to Russian influence in Ukraine. He has been involved in various different parties at various times, but it's fair to say that all of those parties have tended to be very much on the nationalist side of Ukrainian politics. He was one of the co-founders of the Svoboda party in western Ukraine, which, though it is moderate by the standards of some parts of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, has historically been considered very nationalist indeed. He has also played a very significant role in Ukrainian politics. He was a key ringleader in the events in Maidan Square in 2013 and 2014. He was, for a significant amount of time, appointed, I remember when it happened, formally appointed the commandant of the various camps that were established by the protesters on Maidan Square. Though it was never fully defined quite what that meant, it does seem as if, well, it was quite clear, in fact, that he was fulfilling what could be described as a paramilitary role. He does seem to have had general command over some of the fighters who were present in Maidan Square. And, well, as many of you undoubtedly know, the events in Maidan Square in February 2014 eventually spiraled into violence. Many people were killed. They were shot and killed. There's been endless controversy as to who was involved. The protesters, the leaders of the protesters, including Parubiy, blamed the riot police, who were at that time serving President Yanukovych of Ukraine, the president who the Maidan events overthrew. Western governments have endorsed that view, as, by the way, has the current Ukrainian government. But it's fair to say that the various investigations and criminal trials in Ukraine of members of the riot police have never, in my opinion, come to any really convincing or satisfactory conclusions about this. There is an alternative view, most ably researched and articulated by Professor Kachanovsky, Ivan Kachanovsky, who is, I believe, based in Canada nowadays, and who is, by the way, not only Ukrainian, but patriotically Ukrainian as well. He may be a critic of the current government, but he has always been patriotic about Ukraine itself. I know this. I've had encounters with him, both via social media, and on one occasion I interviewed him for a program which we published on the Duran. So Professor Kachanovsky takes a completely different view. He believes that many of the people who were killed by gunfire on Maidan Square were killed by people acting on behalf of the protesters. And I should say that I've always found Professor Kachanovsky's research rigorous and convincing. Now, I am not, however, here to judge the truth of this. There's been no real proper independent investigation about what took place on Maidan Square in February 2014, but suffice to say that Andrei Parubiy was the commandant. He was therefore in overall command of the people who were protecting, if you want to use that word, the protesters. Some of them undoubtedly were armed. I've seen pictures showing that they were indeed armed. And he, in the event that there ever was an investigation, would be a key witness, and he would also presumably be a person who might be held accountable for some of the things that took place on the square at that time. Many of you will have realized that I have been choosing my words again extremely carefully in discussing these events. So Andrei Parubiy played an important role, an absolutely key role in the protests in Maidan Square in 2013 and 2014, and he played an equally critical role in the actions that were taken when these protests expanded and led to the overthrow of the constitutionally elected, internationally recognized president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who subsequently fled to Russia. So a very important person in terms of recent history and of the events that have just been taking place, the recent events which have been taking place in Ukraine. But Parubiy, his importance didn't stop there, because he became an MP in the Ukrainian parliament, He became, for a time, I seem to remember, Speaker of the Parliament. He also became Secretary of Ukraine's National Defense and Security Council, and I believe filled that role around the time of the 2014 and 2015 fighting. And he became a close and very radical political ally of the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, who he is still aligned with. So, an interesting man with a very complex history. Now, it's often the case that the way to try to find out who might have assassinated a particular person is to look at this person's history and background. Now, inevitably, someone like Parubiy will have made many enemies in Ukraine itself. This is a given, and it's almost certain that he would have been deeply unpopular with many people. He was widely supported within the nationalist movement in Ukraine. He was even revered by some of them. I remember that at one point he turned up in Canada, visited Canada, and he was treated during that visit by sections of the Ukrainian community in Canada as a hero. So he's a hero to some, but he would have been seen in a completely opposite way by many others. He might also have been somebody who some people in Ukraine might have seen as dangerous. Now, we have recently been through a period of protests against the current government of President Zelensky. President Zelensky, as we know, has been trying to tighten control of Ukraine. He closed down various or attempted to take control of various anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. For the record, I believe that he does now actually control them. And, well, I personally think that his position is secure, but others think otherwise. There's reports that the Americans are tired of Zelensky and have been attempting to remove him. And, well, could it be that the removal of Parubiy is connected to all of this? After all, he was not at the time of his death part of the Ukrainian power structure. He was an ally, on the contrary, of was an ally of President Poroshenko, who is a rival of President Zelensky's and who wants to overthrow President Zelensky and to replace him in office, and makes little secret of that fact. So could he have been removed for that reason, as part of an internal Ukrainian power struggle? Well, it is certainly possible, and I can't say that I would exclude that possibility entirely. But based on what we have seen about the way in which, as I said, it's been looking increasingly as if the Russians have been pulling off the gloves, have been coming after important people like Colonel Voronich in Ukraine, and have been making other steps as well. I do wonder, and again, I want to stress, I don't know, whether the Russians might not have had a hand in Parubiy's murder. I say this. Firstly, the operation itself was clearly very well organized. People knew where Parubiy was. People knew how to keep an eye on him. Of course, there are people opposed to the Russians in Ukraine who would also have those skills. But I suspect, based on what the FSB and others are saying about the effectiveness of Russian networks in Ukraine, the Russians now do have the means and the people in place and certainly have the skills to pull off something like this. So that might point to the Russians. It's been suggested that the Russians would want Parubiy alive because he's such an important witness to so many of the things that have happened, and that they might want at some point to arrest him and to put him on trial and all of those kind of things. But is there anybody in Moscow who thinks that is a realistic possibility? I would have thought it extremely unlikely. Let us assume that Ukraine were indeed to collapse. It seems to me that Parubiy would be one of those who would make the fastest escape to the West, where he could continue to be a thorn in Russia's side. He showed himself to be a skillful organizer. If there were any plans, for example, to try to create some kind of insurgency inside Ukraine, Parubiy might be one of the people who would be effective in doing that. And that, it seems to me, might be a motive for the Russians to want to get rid of him. So it does seem to me as if the Russians probably, knowing his background, knowing the sort of person he is, knowing that he's completely irreconcilable, might want to remove him from the scene. And, well, they can be pretty ruthless, defending their own interests. And it seems to me that they absolutely would not hesitate, if they thought it was in their own interests, to eliminate someone like this. So, on balance, and I want to stress, I don't know this for a fact, on balance, I think that there is at least a fair chance that it was indeed the Russians. Perhaps there will be an investigation. Perhaps that investigation will provide different clues. We shall see. All I would say is that, of course, from a Russian point of view, eliminating Parubiy might have another advantage and purpose. Parubiy is, if you like, Maidan royalty, one of the best known figures in the Maidan events, somebody who is universally known within the nationalist movement, somebody who's popular with many people around the nationalist movement. Coming after and eliminating someone like him is inevitably going to create a frisson of fear. And if it was the Russians, then that might have been exactly and mostly what this was all about. My own sense is that we are indeed in a dirty war. And this is what, perhaps more than anything else, inclines me to think that it was indeed the Russians. To repeat again, I might be entirely wrong here. But if it was the Russians, then this is conclusive evidence that they are indeed taking the gloves off. And they're not just now limiting their reprisals, and they will certainly see them as reprisals, at the intelligence and security officials like Lieutenant Colonel Voronich, but they're now coming after the political leaders, the political deciders in Ukraine as well. Anyway, we will see. There may be more information about this affair before long, but that's what I'm going to say about it in this program today. Now, let's now talk about the other big piece of news that came about the actual conduct of the special military operation. And it was provided by the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, in a massive meeting which took place yesterday in the Russian Ministry of Defense. This is a meeting convened by the Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. It was actually chaired by him, and its purpose was partly to review the current situation within the Russian military and the Russian military defense establishment. Belousov provided his own report. He received reports from many, many Russian officials, and one of those reports was provided by Gerasimov, and he provided an overview, a more detailed overview of the state of the special military operation from a Russian perspective than any Russian military official has done since March 2022, when I remember that the operations chief of the Russian General Staff, General Sergei Rudskoy, did briefly something very similar, though it must be said that Gerasimov's overview was much, much more extensive. Now, I will anticipate by saying that Gerasimov provided some startling information. I don't think startling is too strong a word. And the general picture that he provided was of Russian advances further and deeper than had been reported before, and of an even worse situation for Ukraine than has been reported up to now. But before I discuss Gerasimov's report, let me just say something about the previous report by Belousov, the defense minister, who, by the way, I noticed was wearing a military uniform, though he is not a military officer. And as far as I know, he hasn't even been given a military rank at the present time. But Belousov did say one very interesting thing, which I presume is true, and which perhaps it's worth taking into account. Belousov said that because of the extremely good organization of the first aid and rescue and medical services in the zone of the special military operation, 97% of Russian soldiers who are wounded are able to achieve a complete recovery and are able to rejoin their units and return to the battle. Now, he didn't provide any overall figures, but the percentage does 97% recovery, full recovery rate from wounds, does suggest, to me at least, that, again, many of these claims of enormous Russian casualties must be wrong. Obviously, I say that you have to believe that what Belousov is saying here is true, but then why exactly would he want to lie about something like this to a meeting of this kind? I mean, it's not as if this is something that was told to the Russian people or the world in general. It was said to a select group of military officers, and you need to go to the Russian Defense Ministry's website and Telegram channel to find out about it. So, given that one assumes that the people who are critically injured is a group within the 3% of Russian soldiers who get wounded, and the people who are actually killed, the soldiers who are actually killed, is another fraction within the 3%. Well, how is it possible, in that case, to reconcile this number that Belarus is giving us, 97% complete recovery amongst people who are injured? How is it possible to reconcile that with some of the astronomical numbers for killed and wounded Russian soldiers that we are hearing? To me, it makes no statistical sense. I am not a statistician, but I find this claim of Belarus's essentially refutes this. Anyway, I mentioned that. Those of you with a better grasp of statistics than me can probably draw your own conclusions. I'll be interested to see what they are. But it was an interesting comment that Belarus said, and I think it deserves more attention than it's received. Let's now turn to what Gerasimov said, and he's provided his account in the usual clipped way that Russian general staff officers do. And it was factual, and it was hardly bombastic, and it was rather dry. Now, the first thing to say is that can we rely on what Gerasimov is telling us? Now, Gerasimov has said things in the past which might cast doubt on some of his credibility. At the start of Ukraine's August 2024 Kursk offensive, he attended a meeting in the Kremlin, which was chaired by Putin, and gave a summary of the situation as it appeared then. This is on I think it was the third day of Ukraine's operation. And I think pretty much everybody now who remembers that presentation that Gerasimov gave will agree that it was fundamentally a false one. It gave an impression of a much more limited operation by the Ukrainians than was actually being carried out, and gave an impression of a situation under control, which at the time that the presentation was given was simply wrong. I mean, the Ukrainians were breaking through, and it looked as if things were far worse in Kursk than Gerasimov was saying. Now, I said at the time, when I read Gerasimov's report, and on one of the programs I did at the time, that it was obvious to me that Gerasimov's report had been extremely carefully coordinated with Putin's office, that it had been very, very carefully prepared, precisely with the purpose of playing down what was happening in Kursk region, so as not to create perhaps alarm and panic, and to give the impression that the situation was indeed being brought under control. And it probably was the case that in the part of the meeting that was not published, Gerasimov was much more frank and forthright about what was actually happening. And by the way, I still think that. But nonetheless, we are faced with the fact that on that occasion, in August 2024, Gerasimov told us things that were significantly less than the whole truth about the military situation. Could he be doing the same thing today? Well, I can't see why, frankly. To repeat again, this is a meeting amongst senior military officials. Obviously, it is not classified because we all know about it, as you can read the entire presentation if you wish. But I'm not really sure why Gerasimov would be providing this information at this time if he thought it was wrong, if he knew it was wrong. If you knew it was wrong, he would not be fooling the Ukrainians because, of course, the Ukrainians would know it was wrong. The Western governments would presumably also know it was wrong as well. The military officers, the Russian military officers he was providing this information to, would presumably also know it was wrong. So why do that? The logic isn't clear to me. And overall, I have to say, I think that Gerasimov probably was speaking in good faith. He did provide us with what he sees, what he thought was an accurate overview of the military situation in the area of the special military operation. Now, it could be that Gerasimov was mistaken on some things. There have been instances over the course of this conflict where it does seem as if Russian military officers on the ground have provided the military leadership in Moscow with false information about the situation. But my own sense is that the Russian military authorities, Gerasimov himself, long ago conducted a purge to remove all officers who did that kind of thing, and that today it's most unlikely that anything like that is happening. So I not only think that Gerasimov almost certainly was talking in good faith, providing us information that he believed was accurate, but I believe on balance that the information is, well, shall we say 90% accurate. It's a dynamic and fluid situation. The presentation was probably prepared over several days. It might not have been exactly up to date as of the time when it was given, but it gives us an overall sense, an accurate sense of where we are. So what did Gerasimov tell us? Well, I'm going to say straight away that another reason why I tend to go with the accuracy of what Gerasimov is saying is that if you have been following dribbles of information that have been published in official Russian sources, namely the TASS news agency, and if you have been going to Russian media outlets like Redovka, who have their reporters on the ground, some of the things that surprised people would not have surprised you. So, for example, let's start with the situation in the north part of the battle lines. And I should say quickly that his main focus, Gerasimov's main focus overall, was on the Donbass situation, Pokrovsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. But he also talked a lot about Kupiansk and Siversk as well. So that central, the key central area of the battlefield, that was where the big revelations were. So what did Gerasimov tell us? Well, let's start with Kupiansk, as I said, in the north, and then start to work our way down. He said that the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk are in effect blockaded. There have been many reports from the Ukrainian side which tell us essentially the same thing. Yesterday, I saw another report that the Ukrainian defenders of Kupiansk have again requested permission from the military and political leadership in Kiev to withdraw from Kupiansk. A request which Zelensky and Syrskyi again refused. They are basically trapped. There are means still where some of them could escape, but the Russians control all of the main roads, and they physically occupy and have cut many of the main roads, and they have drone control, as is now said, over the smaller roads, which might be used, presumably in night time, for any escape by the Ukrainians. Now, it's fair to say that many of the mapping plot projects and bloggers have have been telling us the same thing. But Gerasimov said something else. He confirmed reports about street fighting within Kupiansk itself, which I reported on this channel in the past and which have been discussed on several occasions by the Russian TASS news agency. And Gerasimov further said that around half of Kupiansk is now under Russian control. Now, for the moment, I don't know of any mapping project that has accepted this or was aware of this before Gerasimov said it. But it's consistent with the information I've been seeing in TASS. It's consistent with the information I've been reading in places like Redovka, and I suspect it's true. So we could see that the situation for the Ukrainians in Kupiansk is significantly worse than even the worst reports coming from the Ukrainian side have been acknowledging. Now, Gerasimov said less about the situation in Siversk, though he did, he also provided a map, and there are some discrepancies between his map and some of the other maps that have been provided, which I'm not going to discuss in any great detail. But suffice to say that as far as I could see, he basically confirmed much of the information we've been getting from the various maps that have been published. But he also said, and he was very clear, that the Russians have actually broken into Siversk itself and that fighting is already taking place inside the town. And this is consistent with a piece of information that our old friend Andrei Marochko gave, which I mentioned yesterday, that the Russians had reached Siversk. They were within 500 meters of the town, having advanced on Siversk from the northeast. And it looks like in the hours that followed that report by Marochko, the Russian army has broken into Siversk, and there is now an ongoing battle taking place there. Now, moving further westwards, he provided perhaps the most interesting information of all. Now, here he was talking about the situation in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, North and Konstantinovka conurbation. Firstly, a couple of weeks ago, whilst the Battle of Chasiv Yar was still underway, it became clear that the Russians were making significant attempts to gain and capture territory north of Chasiv Yar. And it looks as if this process has continued. It seems that various Ukrainian-controlled villages in this large area have been surrounded, that the Russians are gradually working to reduce and capture all of these villages. And suffice to say, the Russians appear to be establishing stable positions immediately to the east of Kramatorsk, the central and biggest city within the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk Konstantinovka conurbation. It is increasingly looking as if the Russians are working towards preparations for a storming operation, not just of Konstantinovka, we'll come to that in a moment, but of Kramatorsk as well. And it could be that these two operations will be conducted in parallel with each other, very much like the battles for Toretsk and New York were. Just to say, on the Konstantinovka area, but in the area of Konstantinovka, he confirmed that the Russians have broken into Konstantinovka itself, that fighting is taking place in the town, and he also confirmed that there are still Ukrainian troops south of the Kliban-Beek reservoir, and that they are trapped, and that the Russian army is currently reducing them. It's basically rounding up these Ukrainian soldiers, and that it's gradually, well, it's clearing in effect the Kliban-Beek, the area south of the Kliban-Beek reservoir, that there's still some Ukrainian holdouts there. Now, on the question of Pokrovsk, in some ways this is the most interesting piece of information of all, alongside that from Chasov Yar, the area around Chasov Yar, because Gerasimov corroborated the consistent reporting from Radovka, the newspaper based in Smolensk. Radovka has long been saying that the Russian army, as well as working to capture the two villages of Rodinska and Belitska, north of Pokrovsk, the two villages that lie along the main road, the main supply road, leading from the north into Pokrovsk. Radovka has been saying that the Russians have crossed the road, established stable positions west of the road, and that their forces are operating immediately outside the village of Grishine, to the northwest of Pokrovsk, immediately north of the one big remaining supply road, the E50 road. And Gerasimov confirmed this, not so much in words, but his map showed an area of control of the Russian army west of Rodinska and Belitska, leading all the way to Grishine itself. And Gerasimov said that Pokrovsk is effectively encircled. The Russians have, as he put it, blockaded Pokrovsk. Despite the Ukrainian attempts to redeploy forces there, the Ukrainian redeployment of troops to the Pokrovsk area, the various Ukrainian counterattacks, the Russians have cut all the main supply roads leading into Pokrovsk. They have in effect closed the E50 motorway and the railway lines and all of the other ways in which the garrison inside Pokrovsk receives supplies. Now, I didn't get much sense of what the situation southwest of Pokrovsk, in places like Udachnie and Sergeyevka and in the Pokrovska mine were. Gerasimov didn't go into that granular detail, but Radovka, which has been consistently correct in its reporting, says that Udachne is now firmly under Russian control, and that the Russians are indeed fighting for control of the Pokrovska mine, southwest of Pokrovsk, which, once it is captured, will in effect close the circle. Now, Gerasimov also confirmed that there is fighting underway within Pokrovsk itself, and interestingly, and this, what I'm going to say now, tends to corroborate his accounts. He also confirmed that a Ukrainian counterattack that the Ukrainians had been talking about rather a lot in the area of Novoekonomichne and Mirnograd had indeed achieved a small amount of a success. It had actually reoccupied some of the buildings in the south of Novoekonomichne and had managed to push westwards towards some other village. So this is one instance when the Russian General Staff, the chief of the Russian General Staff, actually did confirm claims of one particular Ukrainian counterattack. Now, Russian reports, both before and since, have said that this counterattack was mostly unsuccessful, that it's left many Ukrainian troops effectively surrounded, that the Russians are in the process of recapturing all of this lost ground, that the Ukrainians have exhausted themselves in the area by conducting this counterattack. All of that is true. All of that may be true. I don't know, but quite possibly it is true. But the key thing is, the key point I'm making here is about the credibility of the information that Gerasimov is giving us. And here Gerasimov is confirming information that the Ukrainians themselves have provided about one of their counterattacks. So again, that points further towards Gerasimov's credibility. So in the key area of Pokrovsk, he says that the town is blockaded. He shows, by the way, all of the territory pretty much in the northeast of Pokrovsk, where the Russians achieved their breakthrough under Russian control. It does seem as if there is indeed fighting going on in Shakhovo, the village to the east of this breakthrough area, but Gerasimov didn't discuss that. But the key thing is he appeared to confirm that as a result of the breakthrough, the Russians have, in effect, blocked the Ukrainians inside Pokrovsk. Now, today, as it happens, Ivan Klimakovsky, one of the aides of Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Russian-backed regional government in Donetsk region. Anyway, Klimakovsky says that the Russians have complete air control over Pokrovsk, that their drones operate at will over Pokrovsk, that the Ukrainians basically cannot move in Pokrovsk without the Russians being aware of it, and their FPV drones and their other types of drones being able to attack and destroy Ukrainian armor and people who are moving inside Pokrovsk. And perhaps in order to illustrate that point, a video was published today by the Russians which showed a Ukrainian vehicle moving in the northern area of Pokrovsk, just north of the railway line that bisects, that transits through Pokrovsk. And, well, this vehicle, the nature of which I couldn't make out at all, was indeed destroyed by bombs being dropped from a Russian drone. So anyway, it does seem as if there is, for the Ukrainians, an operational crisis in Pokrovsk. And as I said, again, if you've been reading Radovka and TASS, this is unsurprising, but we now have confirmation of this, apparent confirmation of this from Gerasimov himself. So overall, one gets the sense that the situation in Donbass is now becoming critical to an even greater extent than perhaps some people in the West fully understand. Now, in providing his account of the battles, his account of the situation, Gerasimov also made some other very interesting points. He said that this was a discussion of what has been happening on the front lines in the spring and summer, after, in other words, the successful capture of Kursk region, which took place in March, and the defeat of the Ukrainians there. But he said that the Russians now are working on the next stage of their ongoing offensive. There's been much discussion and rumor and debate about the Russian offensive having some end point this summer. Gerasimov clearly doesn't think so, because he's talking about a developing offensive and of an offensive continuing. And he also spoke about the nature of the fighting. He said that the Ukrainians have been using all their forces to try to slow the Russian offensive, that this has never prevented the Russians from continuing their advances, and that the Russians have the initiative on every part of the front line, but that it is obliging the Ukrainians to shuttle their various elite formations from one part of the front lines to another, to plug holes and gaps in the front lines, and that the Ukrainian elite formations have in effect become fire brigade units, trying to put out fires wherever the Russians light them, trying to plug holes wherever the Russians punch them through. And the implication is that these brigades are becoming exhausted. So that was an interesting comment too. And one could see again how, from a Russian perspective, not only are the Russians coming closer, much closer, I think, than many had appreciated, to breaking the main Ukrainian defense line, the four towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk, but that they continue the policy of aggressive attrition that I've discussed in many programs. Now, there are reports this morning that the Russians are in the process of completing a major regrouping of troops and reinforcement of troops, specifically in the Pokrovsk area. To repeat again, Gerasimov said that the Russians are preparing the next stage of their offensive. If these reports are correct, then perhaps the Russians are now close to deciding that the moment has come to bring the fighting in Pokrovsk to an end, to capture Pokrovsk, and in effect to break the Ukrainian defense lines. Because if Pokrovsk falls, as I've discussed many times, the other Ukrainian defenses in the other three towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, risk being outflanked. In fact, if Pokrovsk falls in the south and Kupiansk falls in the north, and the Russians capture Siversk, which they look likely to do, and the Russians capture Liman, and there's been other news, this time from bloggers, about more Russian advances in the Liman front. It seems the Russians are about to capture another village just north of Liman called Shandrigalova, and that will bring the Russians very close to Liman indeed. Anyway, if all of this happens, then it seems to me that over the next few months, unless the Ukrainians decide to conduct an orderly retreat from the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, there is a genuine, real risk that they, meaning the better part of the Ukrainian army, could find themselves trapped essentially in a cauldron. But anyway, we shall see what works out, but it does look to me as if there is a strong possibility that the Russians are indeed planning some kind of big operation in Pokrovsk. And to repeat again, I think that this is the Schwerpunkt, the main area of focus. It's where the Russians want to achieve their breakthrough. They have their reserve armies ready to exploit it. Once this line of cities is broken, they can advance north towards Kharkiv, or they can advance west to the river, to the Dnieper. They can do all kinds of different things. Anyway, that's Gerasimov, a most interesting discussion, providing us insight both into Russian strategy, the way that aggressive attrition still represents the key way in which the Russians conduct the war, and also the actual tactical situation in all the key places where the fighting is continuing to happen. Now, you might assume from all of this that the Ukrainians and their Western allies are keen on trying to bring this all to an end before the collapse in Ukraine comes. But if we're talking about the Ukrainian government, and if we're talking about their European allies, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Axios, the US news magazine, has now published a most interesting article in which it says that President Trump and some of his officials are gradually coming round to the conclusion that the Europeans don't really want to see the war ended. They would rather see the war continue, and that they're continuing to feed the Ukrainians with unrealistic hopes for aid and support, and in order to keep the Ukrainians fighting, and in order to ensure that the war goes on. I have to say, I found that article in Axios one of the most jaw-dropping articles I have ever read at any point over the period of this conflict. If it's only now dawned on Donald Trump and some of his officials that it is in fact the Europeans and the Ukrainians, not the Russians, who have been stringing him along and who are trying to prolong the war, and who have been rejecting all realistic steps towards agreeing a resolution of the conflict, well, then all I can say is that Trump and his people are complete innocents. And it is remarkable how naive they have been. Now, I have to say this. I don't get the impression that Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Steve Witkoff or any of the others are genuinely naive people. And I think that deep down they've all probably known about this for some time. I suspect they've been talking about this with each other for some time. Also, I suspect that Trump himself is constantly trying to find ways round this enormous obstacle that the Europeans represent, and he understands that the Europeans are a problem not because they are powerful in themselves, but because they are allied to the neocons in Washington, including some of the neocons who populate his own administration. Well, I suspect that this article in Axios, and it's interesting, by the way, that there are some people in the administration who appear to be briefing Axios. Anyway, I suspect that this is a reflection of the seething anger within a part of the administration following the attacks on Steve Witkoff. The members of the administration who are angry about these attacks on Steve Witkoff probably understand, undoubtedly do understand, in fact, that these are not goodwill attacks. That it's not, the criticisms of Witkoff are not because the Europeans actually think that Witkoff is incompetent, or that he doesn't understand Putin, or that he isn't briefing Trump properly, or any of those things. The reason the Europeans are trying to discredit Witkoff is because they're trying to discredit the entire process of discussion between the Americans and the Russians, because they don't want that process of discussion to proceed and result in the achievement of some kind of peace in Ukraine. A peace which, as President Trump has apparently already told his officials, given the realities of the war, can only in the end be on something close to Russian terms. So one can sense some of the anger building up. We've seen the Americans refusing to criticize the Russian drone and missile attacks on Kiev. We can see the strong pushback, not just from J.D. Vance now, but from other members of the administration against the attacks on Witkoff as well. And we can also see some of the other criticisms that are taking place and some of the other steps that the administration is taking. One of the most remarkable of which, by the way, I should have mentioned previously, is the administration's decision. It's attributed to Tulsi Gabbard, but I am sure that it was a joint decision of the president. The decision by the administration to deny information to the members of the Five Eyes alliance, which of course means in this context the British, about the ongoing discussions between the Americans, the administration, and the Russians. Something which, to my knowledge, is unprecedented and must have caused deep alarm, though unstated alarm, in London. But when I said that this was a jaw-dropping article in Axios, you know, that the idea that the Americans have only just now realized that the Europeans don't really want peace and all of that. When I said that, well, you don't really need to spend too much time doing what I do on these programs and analyzing in detail the various European discussions and the various machinations and intrigues that the Europeans engage in to see that. All you need to do is, first of all, to listen to Vladimir Putin, who over the course of the press conference in Alaska, in effect warned Trump about the fact that the Europeans were most unlikely to be constructive and would instead be as obstructive and engage in as many intrigues as they could in order to derail the entire process. So you can listen to Putin, but there's someone else you could listen to as well, and that is Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And he's back at it once more. Yesterday, he made a further speech in which, surprise, he said that the only way forward is through an unconditional ceasefire, in other words, a freezing of the conflict. And he says that everybody except the Russians agrees. Everybody agrees? Donald Trump said in the meeting with Putin in Anchorage that he'd come round to Putin's point of view, that an unconditional ceasefire was not the way forward. Trump actually wrote a comment on Truth Social about this. And yet here we have Zelensky repeating once more that demand which the Russians have always rejected for an unconditional ceasefire, and implying that everybody, including Trump himself, is still in agreement with that approach. Now, what is that if not an attempt to sabotage the understanding the Americans and the Russians, Putin and Trump, reached in Alaska? There's much commentary and talk in the media in the West about how Trump always puts the pressure on Zelensky as opposed to Putin. I don't really think this is true at all. After all, Trump continues to authorize weapons transfers to Ukraine. He continues to provide indirectly financial and economic assistance to Ukraine. He threatens the Russians with sanctions all the time. How can one say that that is not pressure? Perhaps the problem is not that he doesn't pressure Putin, but that he doesn't pressure Zelensky enough. He doesn't take Zelensky and the Europeans to one side and tell them, look guys, this war is lost. If you continue in this way, the Russians will break through in Donbass. They will do so fairly soon. And then you'll be in a far worse position than the one you're in today. And it could be that the outcome will be that you will not only lose, but that you will lose all. Trump has never done that. And unless and until he does, I suspect his diplomatic moves, such as they are, will be stillborn. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.